Hello, my name is Daniel Becker and welcome to Off the Wall Novels. Today, my co-host will not be joining me, although you can probably hear him squeaking off screen. He just didn't want to come out of his cage. His name is Pringle, he's a great bird. But I wanted to give you guys an update on the Kingdom of Liminal Space, which is the album and the novel that I have been working on, and they correspond with one another, both lyrically, but then also the sound of the album mirrors the trajectory of the sound of the protagonist, which I'll explain here before too long. And so I've always wanted to put out a multimedia project like this. There are going to be video elements of this too, so it's going to be an enormous thing. It's been a huge undertaking, but I think that everything is on track to get it out the door by Christmas. And it's actually the second project of this sort that I have worked on, because my first novel, or novella, Abraham, had musical components to it as well as a music video. And as proud as I am of it, I think that it was a little too big of a project for me to do justice to in my early 20s. I put it out when I was like 23. I'm still very proud of it. It's an important stepping stone on my journey, but I think the Kingdom of Liminal Space is going to blow it out of the water, which is really, really cool to see. And it's kind of shown me that a lot of that experience has accumulated, because in between the Kingdom of Liminal Space and Abraham, I put out Lionel, Lancet, and the Right Vibe, as well as another EP called I Quit. And you can find both of those in the link in my bio, but then also here on YouTube, I've got the EP, and it's on pretty much any streaming platform as well. If you search Danny Backer, not Daniel Backer, then you should be able to find it. Let me know if you have any trouble finding that. But it's got kind of a proggy, synthy, math rock sound to it. And I'm very proud of that one. I think it's the best EP that I've put out. And I think that the album for the Kingdom of Liminal Space is going to be even better. So it's been super cool. But like I was saying, yeah, just in working on Lionel and in reflecting on Abraham, I was able to use that accumulated experience to take just some different risks and different chances with the Kingdom of Liminal Space. So I wanted to share not just updates on the workflow and the progress on the novel, but also just things that I've learned about the creative process in working on these two different media, and yeah, just share my excitement, build some hype around both of those projects. So I will get to the lessons that I've learned about the writing process in a second, but as far as the album goes, that was pretty much what got my focus here at the beginning of the summer, because I've been working with two musicians, a bassist and a drummer, that I met through Craigslist of all places, and they have been an invaluable asset to this project, because sometimes as creatives, or just I'm speaking for myself, I feel like I need to do everything on my own. You know, it's the vanity project. It's got to be the Danny Backer show. And as fun as that is, it's extremely exhausting. And as inspiring as living in New York City is, it's just not sustainable for me to be the star of every single aspect of it. And it is kind of a vanity thing to just want to have my name on every nook and cranny in every credit on this project. And so I've outsourced that to some amazing musicians, and I started the summer by doing a drum tracking session. Shout out to Juniper Sounds in Brooklyn, because they just gave us a fantastic rate and did a fantastic job. And Abigail Rodriguez, the drummer that I hired, just nailed it. And what's super cool is she comes from a pretty different musical background. She does like jazz and orchestral stuff, and she'll actually be touring with the live orchestra version of the animated Spider-Man screening. She's going to be drumming for that, so she's really cool, has some great credits, but is not familiar with math rock or prog rock at all. And so it was just cool to communicate some of that aesthetic to her, but also to let her stray from that, because I am somebody that, you know, doesn't really want to be locked in by a genre. I do believe, at least for my own artistry, I want to try to step outside of something and kind of come up with something that I did not expect or could not have planned. And a lot of that artistic philosophy I developed through taking a bunch of improv classes in Chicago. And I should probably do a video on this channel about a lot of the artistic insight that I gained from that. Actually, you know, I did a video on this called, I think it's called How to Be a Beautiful Genius Artist, or something like that. But one of the biggest insights that I got from those teachers in those classes was that planning can actually hobble the creative process, because you're thinking linearly. You're trying to rationalize your way through something that's supposed to be intuitive and inspired and oftentimes chaotic. And so they put me through a bunch of exercises, but then also just gave me amazing pieces of wisdom and advice and philosophy about the creative process that is applicable to pretty much any creative medium that you do. And so that has just been really cool to mine within a multimedia project like the Kingdom of Liminal Space, because especially with a deadline and with putting it on a pedestal and treating it as this big project that I need to get out the door, I inevitably drift toward the rational and the logical and like what things have to be. But what's interesting about the artistic process is that nothing has to be anything. And I'm not doing this on assignment. I created the assignment. All of this is just a project that I've wanted to do. I get to make the rules. And so that's why I think the artistic process is very spiritual, because you have to take a look at those tendencies that arise. And when there are different stakes, even if you create them and even if they are kind of artificial, you see those shadow sides of yourself come out and you have to deal with them in a way that is kind of low consequence. Because if I make some mistakes on my artistic project, like what difference does it make, right? It's actually, ironically, an authentic expression of myself, even if it's not perfect. And so let me get back on track. We did an amazing drum session with Abigail Rodriguez. She just came up with some really awesome fills. We did a couple rehearsals beforehand, and yeah, she surprised me in the rehearsals and in the recording process. And the intern and the engineer that we worked with at Juniper Sounds both were like, oh my gosh, you guys are so well rehearsed, and everything came out really fluidly, and they loved her. Just like her choices that she made were just super sharp, so it was very gratifying to work with her. And then I had my bassist that I hired, Jack Beal, come over to do some amazing bass work right here in this room. So you can't really tell from this perspective, but I live in a tiny little room in a 3-bedroom in Brooklyn, and Jack Beal was gracious enough to squeeze in here with his gear to lay down just some amazing bass parts. And what's been really cool, harking back again to that discovery and kind of engaging with things that you don't expect in the creative process, is that I had over-arranged a lot of these songs that I had planned on, in addition to drums and bass, planned on doing a bunch of synth parts and like guitar overlays and everything. But the parts that Abigail and Jack came up with were so excellent that I'm listening to them and I'm kind of like, they actually sound kind of done. And I think a reason for this is that I had temporary parts for drums and bass just in the demos that I've done on my computer, and they didn't seem enough. And so I felt the need to like make it more and more and more. But I'm very delighted to find that in going back through these almost completed tracks now, it's like I don't think they need a lot of extra work. They don't need all of those layers. And that actually kind of relates to something that I'm encountering in the themes and symbols in the book, this idea of the artistic process being something that's human or machine made. And this is obviously an enormous topic nowadays with AI. And you guys have probably seen the tweet or the meme of people saying, like, I didn't want the future to be machines writing poetry while I go to work for a living. And so even though the book doesn't explicitly explore AI, the modular synth essentially is a machine that makes music. Now, you have to do a lot to it. It's still an instrument, right? But I think to an untrained eye or to someone who is not familiar with electronic music, it can look like this death knell to humanity and art. And I had that naive perspective on electronic music for a long time, and I think a lot of people naively think this about like DJ sets or electronic music, that it's like, oh, they're not really doing anything, they're just like pushing buttons, you know. And my response to that would definitely be that it's often closer to being like an arranger than someone who's playing a traditional instrument. But even that isn't perfectly true, because you can still play the modular synth and the DJ turntables like an instrument. It just has its different interface on it, and the sound is going to kind of conform to that interface. But all of that is to say, the sound that I'm arriving at on this album, I want it to start out very organic and it to sound really human. And there's an amazing, I almost said Rick Rubin quote where he talks about how when you go into the studio, and he uses the guitar for an example, and you have guitar layered on top of guitar layered on top of guitar. He says it sounds like guitar. But when you have a talented musician laying down an awesome guitar part, it sounds like a person playing the guitar. And in that traditional Rick Rubin way, that just bowled me over because I knew exactly what he was talking about. And as much as I like prog rock and math rock, that often gets accused of just getting lost in technicality and like more is more. I'm somebody who's really a connoisseur of the guitar, and I appreciate a person playing the guitar when it sounds like you can hear their hand going up and down the steel strings, and like the little mistakes and the little quirks are actually what make it sound like what it is. And I've always believed that there is a world of difference between my favorite math rock bands than something like Dream Theater. And if you like Dream Theater, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to shit on your favorite band, but to me that kind of sounds like technicality for its own sake versus inspired, intentionally trying to play outside the box a little bit. And so that's something that I'm trying to explore both on the album and in the book. But then it is undeniable that guitar is not the dominant instrument anymore. There was a very, very long period of time where guitar-driven music was the dominant medium, and that's just not how it is anymore. And as somebody who invested a lot of my youth and my present in becoming a good guitarist, there were different times, I think especially when I was living in Los Angeles, where I felt like I had wasted my time. And that era of music is just behind us, and I was essentially back at square one. And it was very depressing. And it was also not true, but it was a perception that I had. And it's a negative thought pattern that I fell into. That none of that work accumulated, none of that creativity was worth anything. Nobody's going to go listen to those old albums that I did, and it's depressing. And then I think approaching 32, I also started to think of just like, oh, 30 is kind of like a monument in your life. It's like a sign or a symbol of something, even if you don't want it to be. And so, to be honest with you, approaching 30 and after 30 was a lot more difficult than just 30. Like my 30th birthday and even most of my 30th year were not that depressing or anything. But I think when I turned 31, you start to play these like mental games in your head where you're like, if it was going to happen, it probably would have happened by now, right? And then again, you start to just fall into like, oh, well, I guess the rest of my life now will just be failure, obscurity, and misery. And again, this is a cognitive distortion. This is catastrophizing. And it's still easy to fall into, though. And so that's a big thing that I'm trying to explore within this novel of the main character is a guitarist, and then the very first scene, he encounters a young girl who lugs a modular synth on stage, and she just bowls the whole crowd over. Everybody loves it. It's so new, so alien. It's like not only fun, but it feels like the next step of music as a cultural technology. And he just feels like, oh my God, not only is she getting more recognition from the crowd, but it seems so simple and so like she didn't have to ruminate over creating this or like develop any technical skills necessarily, even though there's a lot of technical skills that go into the modular synth. This is just his perception. And again, he just feels very sidelined, very overshadowed, and like he has wasted his entire creative output. And obviously all of this is kind of rooted within a very narrow framework that the only proper manifestation of a musical pursuit is fame or commercial success. And that is something that I had to encounter, and it is why I am so glad that I lived in Los Angeles for a while, because I think it, one, made me heighten my creative output, but two, made me recontextualize just what I wanted to get out of art. Because I moved out there in order to do film, and I moved out there and ended up just like biking with a bunch of Europeans and writing a novel. And so it really allowed me to shift my perspective. But at the same time, being in an industry town, an entertainment industry town, made me just level up. It made me like, oh, I don't have any more excuses. And so I used to be afraid to write music with lyrics in it. And so I think living in Los Angeles allowed me to be like, no, put up or shut up. Even if it sounds terrible, I don't have the best voice in the world. But I started listening to Elvis Costello, and he inspired me. It's like, oh, that guy can't sing, but I love his voice. Love Elvis Costello's voice. And so it just made me realize, like, I don't have to be, I don't know, insert amazing singer. All I have to do is just like really nail something that's within my range and write my songs that can kind of like maximize what I can do rather than starting back at square one. That's the theme in this video and a lot in the book too, of this feeling that like none of that work is accumulated. But my experience in LA showed me it doesn't have to, you know. But it still made me level up and take some bigger chances. But then too, I was there for 5 years and I ultimately discovered this is not what I want. And more than creative success, I think I really wanted recognition. I think I wanted to just be able to introduce myself to people and tell them I have a cool job and on a TV show you've heard of. Not that I got anywhere close to that. Like, again, I didn't really end up following through on a lot of the plans for moving out there, but I was in my early 20s too. Like, what are you going to do? That me being wrong about what I wanted to do there was like one of the best things that could have happened to me. And then that was only amplified when I moved to New York and got a survival job as a substitute teacher. And I think I've discussed this in other videos too, but I still had a little inkling in the back of my mind that I wanted a creative career. And I think for those same kind of superficial reasons, that sure, I wanted to do what I loved every day, but really I wanted to be able to tell people I have a unique, remarkable job, you know? And people don't really care, but I thought that that was what I needed just in order to, you know, be the best version of myself, or to kind of like deliver on all of the hard work that I put into creativity throughout my life. And then in getting this survival job at this school, I just woke up one day and was like, oh my God, I am so happy. I just can't believe how happy I am to like have such a social job and get to encounter so many people from different backgrounds and just like push me out of my comfort zone. And one of my friends pointed this out to me too, and I didn't appreciate this until after the fact, but like it really gave me an untraditional transplant experience, because so many people move to the coasts to pursue creativity, and inevitably you end up in a bubble of other people that are pursuing creativity. But I got plugged into a charter school which just had a bunch of people who were not pursuing that in any way, and I think it gave me such a wonderful experience that I would not have gained if I had just gotten my survival job and then hung out with actors and musicians all day, you know. So let me try to get back on track. All of that is to say that the entity that entered my mind when I got into teaching made me the happiest that I have ever been in my entire life. Like that, whatever it was that swam in my ear and repositioned the way that I looked at the world, is absolutely going to show up in this novel. Although, as autobiographical as it sounds, it still is a work of fiction. So I'm inspired by a lot of the experiences that I've gone through in the past couple years, but it's not that autobiographical. I'm using those as kind of a springboard for me to explore some different things that I've wanted to talk about in fiction for a very long time. And I think that I finally had the experience to do it in the way that I want to, which conveniently leads me to just some of the things that I've learned about the writing process this time around. I think the biggest thing that I've taken from working on the Kingdom of Liminal Space, the novel, is that ruminating on the novel is not helpful. And I think why I ruminated so much on Abraham was that I didn't know how to write a novel. I did not know what I was doing. And there's only so many like craft books and YouTube videos you can watch before you just have to write, and then you start writing it and you realize like, yeah, that stuff is kind of helpful, but all of the problems that you run into just arise out of the creative choices that you make. And so there's not a lot of like little aphorisms or pithy sayings that can knock you out of that. You essentially just have to get into the mud and just like make some choices and live or die by the consequences of that. And then with Lionel, even though I think is a vastly superior novel to Abraham, I was working on it during the pandemic. And so I just had so much free time to like ruminate about it and think of like what it should be and figure it out and do a lot of like free writing that I'd only keep a little morsel of and this, that, and the other. Whereas with the Kingdom of Liminal Space, I think living in New York City while working on it did not give me any time to ruminate. It's a very stimulating place. And it's easy to fall into distractions. And so I think it just ended up being the perfect thing for me because I really worked on this. I worked on it very hard, but also very sporadically, and it was very touch and go. And I just really did not develop a lifestyle here that gave me time to just sit and ponder about what my novel was supposed to be. And that's like the biggest takeaway that I've gotten from this process of that. Like, it doesn't matter unless it exists on the page. And so my process that I've gone through, that I've done this for each novel, but it's been a little refined each time, is a ton of free writing at the beginning. And so when I first moved to New York, every single day before I got a job, I would wake up in the morning, go to a coffee shop, and just fill up as much writing on a legal pad as I could. And even though I'm going to continue doing that for future projects, I think what I learned in doing that this time was that most of that writing is not productive. Now, the good part of that writing is that little nuggets pop out that you never could have planned. It's mining that improv philosophy, right? But what I'm finding, a lot of my free writing ends up being describing the effect that I want the book to have, rather than coming up with discrete information that evokes that effect. So I'm essentially like describing something that I want the metaphor to mean. I want the reader to take this away when this character says something to this character, you know? It's almost like, would that my novel was this? And I don't think it was wasted time, but in editing it and coming up with subsequent drafts, I'm finding I'm deleting so much of that free writing. And even sections that I thought were really amazing, when I go back and I look at them, excuse me, I'm finding that there's a musicality to it and it sounds nice, but when I really look at what I wrote, I'm like, oh, there's only like one or two good ideas in this. I'll fill up a whole page and I'm just like, oh, there were some cool kernels that popped out, but it's really not as done as I thought that it was, you know? And so I think going forward, what I'm going to do is try to outline a little bit more meticulously and then try to do some free writing within those parameters of the outline. And this also leads me to the next big thing that I've learned. And this is something I knew intellectually, but I didn't like really know it. I didn't really internalize it until I've been working on the Kingdom of Liminal Space, is that novels are all about specifics. Like, what makes it really feel real and like big? That's the word I always use when I read like Pynchon or David Foster Wallace or The Age of Innocence. That it feels big. It doesn't just feel like some like minimalist prose or some like this little situation. It feels like a whole world in front of you. And it's those specifics that make that happen. And so in the future, I think what I want to do, both from like drawing specifics from the research, but then also in the free writing, is making it much more discrete, specific choices that evoke those bigger ideas and those like moods and that feeling of it being big, you know, and it feeling like there's actually a world that you're entering into rather than just some little story, you know. I hope that's clear. I think you guys might get what I mean by big, but maybe not just a little story. It doesn't matter. But again, I have had a blast working on both of these projects. I just wanted to give you guys an update. I didn't expect it to go this long, but I just got carried away. And so I'm going to go and end it there. But if you guys would, please check out some of my other videos on this channel. Check out the EP. Order Lionel Lancet and the Right Vibe if you can afford it. Talk to me if you can't. I'm not trying to get rich off this stuff. Just want to share my work with the world. But yeah, I will continue to do some updates as more stuff comes down the pipeline. But I just wanted to share with you guys some of those things that I've been working on, as well as share just some of the lessons that I've learned in all of this stuff. But before we hit the 25-minute mark, I'm going to go ahead and sign off. This has been Daniel Backer. Have a good day, everybody.